Hey there, sleepless rabble. You're safe. You're warm. Probably already half tucked in. So don't move. Let me take over for a while. Welcome back to our little freak show. No tickets, no queues. Just you, at home, listening, while we quietly travel somewhere else. Tonight we're heading all the way to Australia. A place of sun, beaches, and exactly the kind of man who never really belonged in daylight. Our next specimen is already on board. A familiar face to some, a walking warning sign to others. Violence, charisma, bad teeth, worse decisions, served with a grin that never quite explained anything. You know the drill. If you like wandering through the darker corners of human nature, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments who you think should join our freak show next. This is Napmax Stories, and tonight we're taking you to Australia to meet a man who turned his own damage into a brand. As always, we start at the very beginning. Bana Chopper. Reed was born in Melbourne in 1954 into a household that was not actively criminal, but quietly corrosive. There was no mythology waiting for him there, no underworld glamour, no hardened mentors teaching him how to survive. What he grew up with instead was emotional absence, instability, and a constant sense that nothing around him was solid enough to rely on for long. His father worked at a slaughterhouse, a physically brutal job that shaped both his availability and his temperament. Long hours, exhaustion, and emotional distance were the norm. He was not known as a man who explained things or offered reassurance. He provided what he could materially and little else. His mother, by contrast, was volatile and psychologically unstable, struggling with severe mental health issues that went largely untreated. Her behavior oscillated between detachment and aggression, leaving the household unpredictable and tense. Affection, when it appeared at all, was inconsistent enough to feel unsafe. This was not a home that offered structure in any meaningful sense. Discipline existed, but it was reactive rather than guiding. There was no emotional safety net, no sense that mistakes could be repaired through understanding. For a child already prone to aggression, this environment did not correct behavior. It amplified it. From a young age, Reed displayed behavioral problems that alarmed teachers and adults around him. He was isolated, struggled to connect with peers, and reacted to frustration with outsized rage. School reports described a child who was difficult, disruptive, and emotionally unreachable. Other children avoided him, not because he was strange, but because he was frightening. Authority figures tried punishment, removal, exclusion. None of it worked. There was little effort to understand why he behaved the way he did, only attempts to suppress the behavior itself. Violence entered his life early, not as a sudden break from normality, but as an extension of it. There were incidents involving cruelty to animals, behavior that even in rough neighborhoods stood out as excessive. These acts were not later inventions designed to shock an audience. They were part of the documented concerns raised during his childhood. They signaled a growing detachment from empathy and an increasing fixation on control. What matters here is not the acts themselves, but the response to them. There was no sustained intervention. Mental health care was minimal, especially for working-class families in post-war Australia. Social services were stretched thin and largely reactive. Children like Reed were categorized as problems to be managed, rather than individuals to be helped. Once labeled difficult, he was effectively written off. In this vacuum, he began to learn his most enduring lesson. Attention, when it came, arrived through fear. Fear was immediate. Fear was effective. Fear did not require explanation or permission. While affection was unreliable and praise almost non-existent, intimidation produced clear results. People noticed him when they were scared of him. People backed away. People reacted. By adolescence, this lesson had hardened into identity. Violence was no longer just an outburst. It was a tool. It gave him presence in a world where he otherwise felt invisible. It allowed him to control situations instead of being controlled by them. In an environment where stability was absent and authority felt arbitrary, force became the only constant he trusted. This was not the origin story of a criminal mastermind. It was the slow construction of a mindset in which aggression equaled security and dominance equaled survival. Long before prison cells, media appearances, or self-authored mythologies, the foundation had already been laid. Mark Reed did not emerge from his childhood with a plan. He emerged with a belief that the only reliable way to exist was to be feared. That belief would not stay contained within the walls of his family home for long. As he moved further into adolescence, the behavior that had once unsettled teachers and neighbors began to attract a different kind of attention, drawing him steadily toward the margins of the world he would later claim as his own. By the time Mark Chopper Reed reached adolescence, the pattern set in childhood had hardened into something more deliberate. This was no longer a boy lashing out blindly. This was someone beginning to understand how violence functioned socially, how it shifted power, how it rearranged rooms without asking permission. Fear, he had learned, traveled faster than explanation and lasted longer than sympathy. School had already failed him, or perhaps he had failed school, depending on which version you prefer. Either way, formal education became increasingly irrelevant. Authority figures were no longer just distant or ineffective, they were targets. Teachers, principals, youth officers all blurred into the same abstract enemy, people who wanted compliance without offering protection. Discipline didn't intimidate him. It confirmed what he already believed, that force was the only language anyone truly respected. As a teenager, Reed gravitated toward environments where aggression was not only tolerated, but rewarded. Street culture in Melbourne during the late 1960s and early 1970s offered exactly that. These were not glamorous criminal networks or tightly organized gangs, but loose constellations of young men orbiting pubs, pool halls, and back streets, measuring status in bravado and bruises. It was here that Reed found something resembling belonging, not because he was liked, but because he was useful. Violence by this stage was no longer reactive. It became performative. He exaggerated his unpredictability, leaned into intimidation, cultivated a reputation that traveled ahead of him. Stories circulated, growing slightly with each retelling, until the version of Mark Reed people spoke about was already larger and more dangerous than the boy himself. He did not correct these stories. He refined them. Encounters with police began early and often. Minor charges, street-level offences, altercations that ended with warnings or short detentions. Nothing that suggested inevitability yet, but enough to establish a rhythm. Authority confronted him. He resisted. The system pushed back. He escalated. Each interaction reinforced his belief that conflict was the natural state of things. Crucially, this was also the period where he began experimenting with identity. He was not yet Chopper, but the groundwork was being laid. He adopted exaggerated mannerisms, cultivated a threatening presence, learned how to read a room and dominate it through posture and tone alone. Fear was no longer just a byproduct of his actions. It was the goal. Being known mattered more than being right. Being talked about mattered more than being understood. What separated Reed from countless other violent youths of the era was not intelligence or foresight, but commitment. Others drifted in and out of trouble, tempered by fear of consequences or pulled back by family ties. Reed doubled down. Each confrontation became a test, each escalation proof that backing down was not an option. To retreat would have meant dismantling the only identity he had successfully constructed. There was still no grand criminal ambition at this stage, no talk of empires, no organized syndicates waiting to recruit him. What existed instead was a growing comfort with chaos and a mounting tolerance for brutality. Pain, both inflicted and received, became background noise. Moral boundaries blurred, then disappeared entirely. Violence stopped feeling transgressive and started feeling normal. By the end of his teenage years, Reed was no longer simply a troubled youth. He was a young man who had learned how to weaponize reputation, how to turn unpredictability into leverage, and how to exist permanently on the edge of conflict without flinching. The line between intimidation and action had thinned dangerously, and the informal street violence of his adolescence was beginning to bleed into something more serious. This was the point at which trouble stopped being incidental and started becoming structural. The world he was moving toward would not tolerate amateurism or impulse forever. It would demand loyalty, escalation, and consequences far heavier than bruises or brief detentions. And it was only a matter of time before the violence he had used to announce himself would carry him somewhere he could not simply walk away from. By the early 1970s, Bana Chopper Reed was no longer operating on the fringes of adolescent violence. The petty confrontations, the street-level intimidation, the chaotic skirmishes that had defined his teenage years began to give way to something heavier and far less forgiving. This was the point where violence stopped being personal expression and started becoming currency. Melbourne's criminal underworld at the time was not a sleek hierarchy with clear lines of command. It was fragmented, territorial, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Power moved through fear, but also through utility. You were valuable only if you could do something others preferred not, to do themselves. For Reed, this transition was almost seamless. He did not arrive with strategy or long-term ambition. He arrived with a reputation for volatility and a demonstrated willingness to cross lines most people hesitated at. He was not welcomed as a peer. He was tolerated as a tool. Reed's role in these circles was never that of a planner or decision-maker. He was muscle, intimidation, enforcement. The kind of person sent to frighten someone into compliance, to deliver a message that needed to be felt rather than explained. His lack of restraint made him useful, but it also made him disposable. This was not something he fully grasped at the time. Violence escalated quickly. What had once been spontaneous aggression became targeted and purposeful. Assaults were no longer about ego alone. They served objectives defined by others, debts, disputes, rivalries he did not originate but was happy to enforce. Reed leaned into this role with enthusiasm, exaggerating his brutality to ensure his name carried weight beyond his immediate presence. Fear, again, was his leverage. It was during this period that his relationship with truth began to fracture. Stories about his actions grew more extreme, often told by Reed himself. Each retelling added detail, menace, and inevitability. Whether the events happened exactly as described became increasingly irrelevant. What mattered was that people believed them. Reputation began to replace reality as his primary asset. This environment also brought him into closer and more frequent contact with law enforcement. Surveillance increased. Arrests became more serious. Charges escalated from nuisance-level offences to violent crimes that could no longer be dismissed as youthful excess. Reed responded not by retreating, but by performing. He cultivated unpredictability in police interviews, alternating between cooperation and hostility, half confessions and theatrical denials. The goal was not acquittal so much as confusion. For the police, Reed was a problem without a category. He was too erratic to be a reliable informant, yet too embedded in violent activity to be ignored. His stories contradicted themselves. His statements implicated others, then collapsed under scrutiny. Investigators found themselves expending time and resources, untangling narratives that seemed designed to waste both. Within the criminal circles he operated in, his behavior became increasingly risky. His need for attention and escalation clashed with the unspoken rules of survival. Violence was expected, but discretion was valued. Reed struggled with this distinction. He wanted notoriety, not just obedience. He wanted his name to echo, not disappear into the background of someone else's operation. This tension pushed him toward more extreme acts. Intimidation became more public. Threats more explicit. The line between enforcement and provocation blurred. Where others sought to minimize exposure, Reed seemed to court it. Arrests followed, each more consequential than the last. Short stints in custody hardened him further, reinforcing his belief that prison was not a deterrent, but a proving ground. By the late 1970s, it was becoming clear that this trajectory had only one likely outcome. The underworld did not protect those who drew too much attention, and the justice system had begun to recognize Reed as more than a background nuisance. He was moving toward a collision with authority that would not end in warnings or temporary confinement. What had begun as a search for recognition through fear was now closing in on him from all sides. The criminal world saw him as increasingly unstable. Law enforcement saw him as escalating, and Reed himself seemed incapable of stepping back, bound to the identity he had constructed through years of deliberate intimidation. The next chapter marks the moment where consequence finally overtakes performance, where violence is no longer something he deploys freely, but something that binds him permanently to the system he has spent years provoking. Prison is no longer a possibility on the horizon. It is approaching fast, and it will change the scale of everything that follows. By the late 1970s, Bana Chopper Reed had crossed the threshold where reputation stops protecting you and starts accelerating your downfall. The violence that once kept him relevant in criminal circles now made him visible in a way that could no longer be ignored. Police attention was no longer incidental. It was sustained, deliberate, and increasingly focused. Reed was not pursued because he was clever. He was pursued because he was noisy. His name surfaced repeatedly in connection with assaults, kidnappings, weapons offenses, and intimidation. Witnesses were reluctant but consistent. Patterns formed. He was never positioned as the mastermind, but he was always close to the impact zone, close to the injuries, close to the fear. For investigators, that proximity mattered more than his self-proclaimed mythology. Interviews with Reed became exercises in frustration. He treated police questioning as a performance space rather than a legal process. He would boast openly, then deny specifics. He offered stories rich in detail but poor in verification. Names changed, timelines shifted, motives contradicted themselves. It was not accidental confusion. It was strategy. By overwhelming investigators with noise, he believed he could maintain control. This tactic worked briefly, then spectacularly failed. Detectives began to recognize that Reed was not an unreliable witness by accident, but by design. He polluted information streams, wasted investigative resources, and destabilized cases. Rather than fear him, police grew methodical. They stopped chasing his stories and focused on his actions. Physical evidence, witness corroboration, charge stacking. The system adjusted. Charges escalated accordingly. What had once been treated as street violence began to be framed as serious criminal behavior with long-term risk implications. Kidnapping charges surfaced. Firearms offences were pursued aggressively. Judges became less tolerant of theatrics. Bail became harder to secure. Remand periods grew longer. Reed responded by escalating again. Violence was no longer just a means to an end. It became reinforcement. Each act reaffirmed the persona he believed protected him. To de-escalate, it would have required him to dismantle the only identity that had ever given him power. He chose instead to double down. At the same time, his position within criminal networks deteriorated. His unpredictability, once useful, became dangerous. He talked too much. He attracted attention. He refused to stay small. Others in the underworld understood something Reed either ignored or rejected. Survival required invisibility. Fear was useful, but only when it remained contained. Reed wanted his fear to be public. This made him expendable. Trust eroded. Allies distanced themselves. The violence that had once been transactional became isolating. He found himself increasingly alone, relying on reputation rather than relationships. That reputation, however, was now firmly lodged in police files. Court appearances became frequent. Magistrates saw the same name repeatedly. Patterns replaced anecdotes. Sentencing language shifted from corrective to preventative. The justice system was no longer interested in deterring him. It was interested in containing him. Reed understood this shift, but misinterpreted its implications. He did not see incarceration as defeat. He saw it as relocation. In his mind, prison was not an endpoint, but a new arena. One where violence and intimidation could be recalibrated and amplified. He believed confinement would solidify his legend rather than dismantle it. This belief shaped his behavior as the walls closed in. He did not seek leniency. He did not attempt reform. He leaned into the image that had brought him this far. Courtrooms became stages. Defiance replaced defense. Consequences were no longer avoided but absorbed as proof of toughness. When the sentences finally came, they were not surprising. Lengthy incarceration was inevitable. What Reed did not yet understand was that prison would not simply receive the persona he had built. It would test it, strip it down, and demand a level of commitment far beyond street violence. The collision with authority was complete. The chaos he had used as leverage now boxed him in. The next chapter does not mark the start of imprisonment as punishment, but as transformation, where survival would require more than threats and stories. It would require him to turn his own body into a message and his suffering into currency. When Bana Chopper Reed entered long-term incarceration, he did not arrive as a broken man or a repentant one. He arrived convinced that prison would simply be an extension of the world he already understood. Violence, hierarchy, intimidation. He believed those rules would translate cleanly behind walls. What he underestimated was scale. Australian prisons in the late 1970s and early 1980s were not abstract punishment facilities. They were pressure cookers, overcrowded, under-resourced, violent by design as much as neglect. Authority existed, but it was uneven. Control shifted daily between officers, inmates, and informal power structures that thrived in the gaps. For someone like Reed, this environment felt familiar enough to invite confidence. That confidence evaporated quickly. Inside, reputation mattered, but not in the way Reed expected. Stories travelled fast, but they were tested immediately. Threats were not respected unless they were followed through. Violence did not impress on its own. It had to be precise, strategic, and survivable. Random aggression marked you as unstable, not dominant. Reed's early days inside were defined by this realization. The persona that worked on the street suddenly looked crude. He responded the only way he knew how. Escalation. Reed began provoking conflicts deliberately, inserting himself into situations that did not require his involvement. He challenged authority figures, both inmates and officers, refusing to submit quietly to routine control. Strip searches, cell checks, movement restrictions were all treated as personal affronts. Each confrontation was an opportunity to reassert identity. This behavior earned him attention, but not safety. Other inmates did not see a legend. They saw a man advertising instability. Violence followed, not always on his terms. Fights were frequent. Injuries accumulated. Prison healthcare was minimal and slow. Pain became constant background noise. Where once pain had been a tool, now it was unavoidable. Rather than discouraging him, this reinforced his worldview. Suffering became proof of authenticity. If fear had brought him here, then endurance would keep him relevant. Reed leaned into punishment, collecting injuries as evidence that he could withstand what others avoided. Prison, he decided, would not break him. It would authenticate him. Isolation followed. Authorities recognized him as disruptive, unpredictable, and high risk. He was moved repeatedly, placed in segregation units, monitored closely. Each transfer reinforced his belief that he was exceptional, that the system itself was reacting to him. In reality, he was being managed. This management frustrated him more than open conflict ever had. Segregation stripped him of audience. Without witnesses, violence lost its performative edge. Reed understood instinctively that his power depended on being seen. In isolation, there was no one to intimidate, no one to impress. This was intolerable. To regain visibility, he escalated again, this time turning his own body into leverage. Hunger strikes, self-harm, threats of extreme acts. He learned quickly that institutions responded fastest when faced with liability. Blood, injury, and the promise of worse created paperwork, investigations, transfers. Pain forced reaction. It was during this period that his relationship with his own body fundamentally changed. It stopped being something to protect and became something to deploy. Flesh became message. Injury became communication. If the system refused to listen to words, it would be forced to respond to damage. This mindset did not develop overnight. It was shaped through repeated failures of negotiation, through the dull grind of institutional indifference. Each ignored complaint, each delayed response, each quiet day in segregation pushed him closer toward acts that could not be ignored. Importantly, this was not madness. It was calculation, filtered through desperation. Reed understood the system well enough to know where its breaking points lay. He also understood himself well enough to know that he was willing to cross lines others would not. That willingness became his advantage. By the end of his early incarceration period, Reed had learned something essential. Prison was not impressed by a reputation alone. It demanded spectacle, sacrifice, and escalation. Survival required not just violence against others, but violence against oneself. The system did not care who you claimed to be. It only reacted to what you forced it to confront. This realization set the stage for the act that would define his prison mythology more than any assault or sentence ever could. An act designed not to escape punishment, but to reshape the terms under which punishment was administered. What followed would turn his own body into a headline, and permanently fuse pain with power in the legend of Chopper Read. By the early 1980s, Mark Chopper Read was already a familiar name inside the Victorian prison system, not because of glamour or genius, but because he was difficult to place. He was violent, argumentative, and constantly at odds with the routine. Officers could not rely on him to comply quietly, and other prisoners could not rely on him to stay out of trouble. In that kind of environment, the administration does not try to understand you, it tries to contain you. Reed was placed in a protection unit. On paper, that meant at risk, separated from the general population, kept under tighter control, moved with greater caution. In practice, protection carried a different meaning. Within prison culture, being housed there stamped you with suspicion. The unit was widely associated with informants, debtors, and men who could not safely live on normal wings. Whether the label was fair was irrelevant. Once people believed it, it stuck. Reed reacted badly, and immediately. He insisted he did not belong there, denied being an informant, and argued that the placement itself would make him a target later. The point was simple. Even if the prison said it was for his safety, other inmates would read it as, he talks. He filed complaints and demanded reassignment. The requests went into the system and disappeared into the slow machinery of paperwork. Daily life in protection was suffocating. The atmosphere was not the loud, open hostility of a crowded wing. It was the quiet tension of men who watched their own mouths. There was less movement, less social contact, and fewer chances to establish status through ordinary prison rituals. People kept distance, because closeness could be misread. Officers did not debate, they enforced procedure. For someone who lived on reaction and confrontation, the lack of response was its own kind of punishment. Reed tried to force momentum. He argued with staff, pushed boundaries, created incidents. The result was usually the same. Write-ups, restrictions, more isolation. The system did not bargain with him. It processed him. And the longer he stayed in that unit, the more dangerous the label became. Even if he left later, the story would travel ahead of him. Protection also meant being managed like a contaminant. Movements were scheduled, escorted, and kept away from normal traffic. If he went to the showers, it was timed. If he went to the yard, it was often a smaller space with fewer men, under closer watch. The unit had its own rhythm of boredom and suspicion, and every day inside it repeated the same message. You are here because you are not trusted. Counts came often. Privacy rarely did. Reed's anger was sharpened by the fact that you cannot outfight a rumor. In general population, status could be rebuilt through alliances, intimidation, and the rough theatre of daily contact. In protection, the address did the talking. Men on other wings did not need to meet him to decide what they thought he was. Even when officers behaved professionally, the unit was treated as a holding pen for risks, and that attitude seeped into everything. Clipped answers, delayed responses, and the quiet assumption that complaints from this wing could wait because the men inside were already contained. It was a place designed to reduce incidents, not to solve the grievances that produced them. He kept returning to the practical danger. If he was later moved back among the general population, the protection label would arrive first. The consequences would not be abstract. They would show up as threats, refusals to share space, and opportunistic violence from men eager to prove they did not tolerate talkers. These were ordinary prison calculations, and Red understood them. What he could not get the administration to accept was that short-term safety could manufacture long-term risk. Meanwhile, the small degradations piled up. Forms that vanished, answers that never came, appointments pushed back. Waiting was a kind of control, and it worked best on men who needed action to feel present. Reed would submit a request, get nothing, submit another, receive a generic line, and be told to follow the same channel that had already failed. The loop itself was the mechanism, and it tightened the longer he stayed. His physical condition worsened during this period as well, in a very ordinary prison way. Dental problems, already present, continued. Prison dentistry was limited and slow, and it tended to solve pain by removing teeth rather than repairing them. Inmates waited, then waited longer. Decay and damage accumulated. The details were not dramatic, just grinding, discomfort that lingered, swelling that returned, a mouth that changed over time because care arrived late or not at all. Nothing about his complaints or his escalating behavior achieved what he wanted. He remained in protection. He remained marked. The system remained indifferent. At some point, Reed shifted from trying to persuade the administration to trying to force it. Within a custodial setting, there are only a few events that trigger immediate, unavoidable response. A major medical emergency is one of them. Severe self-injury creates liability, paperwork, oversight, and urgent decisions. It cannot be ignored, and it often requires a reassessment of placement. Reed amputated 2 of his own fingers while in custody. The injury was severe enough to demand emergency treatment and internal review. After medical intervention, authorities reassessed his housing. The protection unit was no longer treated as a stable solution because the incident heightened concerns about what might happen if he remained there, or was later moved from it under the same stigma. He was relocated out of protection. That was the end of the protection unit episode. Not redemption, not triumph, just an administrative decision driven by risk, liability, and the reality that the placement had failed to contain him. After removal from the protection unit, Bana Chopper Reed was reintroduced into the general prison environment under heightened supervision. The move was administrative rather than conciliatory. There was no sense of rehabilitation or reset, only a recalculation of risk. The institution had determined that containment in protection had failed, but that did not mean trust had been restored. Re-entry was cautious and tightly managed. Movements were staggered, contact was monitored, officers were alert to signs of retaliation, not only against Reed, but potentially initiated by him. The stigma of protection did not vanish simply because paperwork changed. It followed him, unspoken but present, shaping how other inmates assessed him from a distance. The general population was louder, more volatile, and governed by informal hierarchies that had little patience for ambiguity. Reputation circulated quickly, stripped of nuance. The fact that Reed had been in protection mattered more than the reasons why. Some inmates kept their distance, others tested him through provocation, watching closely to see whether he would respond with the same volatility that had defined his earlier years. Reed responded by asserting himself immediately. He challenged perceived slights, pushed back against minor provocations, and made it clear that passivity was not an option. These confrontations were not calculated to build alliances or secure long-term standing. They were immediate reactions, designed to interrupt the narrative that protection equaled weakness. Violence did not erupt instantly, but tension was constant. Small incidents accumulated, arguments in shared spaces, threats delivered quietly rather than publicly. Officers intervened before situations escalated fully, a sign that Reed was now viewed less as an unpredictable nuisance and more as a known quantity requiring management. Living conditions were harsher than in protection, but also more familiar. There was noise, movement, and competition for space. Informal rules mattered again. Status could be negotiated, even if precariously. For Reed, this environment restored a sense of agency that isolation had stripped away. He could act, react, and be seen doing so. Medical issues remained unresolved. The injuries from the finger amputations required ongoing care, and the limitations they imposed were immediate and practical. Tasks took longer. Pain fled unpredictably. There was no sense of accommodation beyond what was strictly necessary. Prison. Healthcare addressed function, not comfort. Reed adapted as inmates always did, adjusting routines rather than expecting relief. Dental problems continued as well. Missing teeth affected speech and appearance, both of which mattered in prison culture. Requests for treatment moved slowly. Extractions were still favoured over restorative care. The cumulative effect was visible, altering how others perceived him and how he presented himself. Disciplinary scrutiny increased. Any incident involving Reed was documented carefully. Infractions that might have been ignored in other inmates resulted in reports. Privileges were easy to lose and slow to regain. This constant monitoring limited his ability to operate freely and reinforced the sense that he was being watched, rather than integrated. Despite this, Reed did not withdraw. He engaged with the environment aggressively, refusing to fade into routine. He challenged officers verbally when he felt provoked, though less impulsively than before. He navigated inmate interactions with heightened awareness, measuring responses more carefully. Experience had taught him that unrestrained escalation carried costs he could no longer absorb easily. There was no singular event that defined this phase. It was characterized instead by endurance, day after day of controlled tension, moments of confrontation followed by stretches of enforced calm, a constant balancing act between asserting presence and avoiding administrative backlash. What distinguished this period from earlier incarceration was the absence of illusion. Reed no longer believed prison would be impressed by reputation alone. He understood the limits imposed by surveillance, paperwork, and institutional memory. The system remembered everything, even when inmates tried to forget. Still, he remained resistant to submission. Compliance was tactical, not internal. He followed rules when necessary and tested them when possible. This behavior kept him in a state of near constant evaluation, never fully settled, never entirely out of danger. The return to general population did not resolve the conflicts that had defined his incarceration. It merely relocated them. The same forces were at work. Control versus resistance, visibility versus containment. The difference was scale. Every action now carried heavier consequences, and every misstep narrowed his options further. This phase did not produce transformation or closure. It produced continuity under constraint. Reed remained inside the system, adapting without yielding, surviving without settling. What lay ahead would not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It would emerge gradually, shaped by repetition, attention, and the slow recognition that prison could be used for more than endurance alone. By the mid-1980s, Bana Chopper Reed was already physically marked by years of imprisonment, violence, and neglect, but nothing altered his appearance as consistently or as visibly as the deterioration of his teeth. This was not a sudden transformation, and not the result of a single incident. It was slow, cumulative, and deeply ordinary in the way prison damage usually is. Dental care inside the Victorian prison system at the time was functional rather than preventative. Pain was treated when it became impossible to ignore, but long-term maintenance was rare. Appointments were delayed, requests were processed slowly, repairs were uncommon. Extraction was the default solution. Teeth were removed because it was faster, cheaper, and required less follow-up. The system did not prioritize preservation. Reed entered this phase already with dental damage. Years of fights, poor nutrition, stress, and inconsistent hygiene had taken their toll. Inside prison, these problems accelerated. Swelling, decay, and infection became recurring issues. Pain was constant but uneven, flaring without warning and then receding just enough to be endured. When treatment finally came, it often ended with another tooth removed. Over time, his mouth changed shape. Gaps widened. Speech shifted slightly. Chewing became more difficult. These were not dramatic injuries that triggered emergency responses. They were slow degradations that altered daily function and appearance without ever becoming urgent enough to demand systemic change. Eventually, the cumulative loss reached a point where dentures were issued. This was not unusual. Many long-term inmates received them once enough teeth were gone. The dentures were basic, ill-fitting, and uncomfortable. They restored a degree of function, but they did not feel natural. They slipped, rubbed, and required constant adjustment. Wearing them was tolerable, not pleasant. Reed's relationship with the dentures was practical rather than aesthetic. He used them when necessary to eat or speak clearly, and removed them when they caused discomfort. There was no immediate symbolic intent attached to them. They were a tool, nothing more. The missing teeth beneath them were simply another consequence of long-term incarceration. Within the prison environment, appearance mattered in subtle ways. Facial damage altered how others perceived you, even if no one spoke about it directly. Missing teeth were common enough not to shock, but they carried connotations of long sentences, hard time, and cumulative wear. They marked someone as seasoned, not in a glamorous sense, but in a visibly eroded one. Officers noted the change without comment. Medical staff documented it clinically. Other inmates registered it instinctively. Reed himself did not dwell on it. Pain, once familiar, fades into background noise. Adaptation becomes routine. There was no moment during this period where the teeth became performance. They were not displayed deliberately. They were not discussed as a feature. They were simply there or not there, depending on the day. The dentures went in and out without ceremony, dictated by comfort rather than intention. What mattered was functionality. Could he eat? Could he speak? Could he get through the day without infection flaring again? The answers were inconsistent but manageable. Prison teaches adjustment, and Reed adjusted. This phase passed without narrative emphasis at the time. There were no reports, no attention, no external interest. The condition of his mouth did not define his status or alter his management. It was logged, treated minimally, and folded into the long list of bodily changes that incarceration imposes over years rather than moments. Only later would the teeth become noticeable to people outside the system. At this stage, they were simply another consequence of time served, another mark left by a system that eroded slowly and without drama. Inside prison, no one asked what it meant. They only noticed that it was there. The story moved on, as it always did, leaving the damage in place and carrying everything else forward with it. By the late 1980s, Mark Chopper Reed had settled into the long rhythm of incarceration. Transfers, disciplinary cycles, and medical issues continued, but nothing about daily life suggested momentum. Prison is good at flattening time. Weeks collapse into months. Years pass without markers. For many inmates, that emptiness becomes corrosive. For Reed, it became something to push against. He began writing while still inside, not as a career plan and not with publication in mind. Writing started as occupation, a way to fill hours that otherwise stretched endlessly. Pens were allowed. Paper could be requested. In an environment where movement was restricted and speech was monitored, writing offered privacy of a particular kind. Words on a page were not immediately contested. They did not trigger instant reaction. They waited. Reed had always told stories verbally. In interviews with police, in arguments with inmates, in confrontations with officers, he narrated constantly. Writing transferred that impulse into a quieter space. He wrote about prison, about violence, about himself. The tone was blunt, often crude and unapologetic. There was no attempt at reflection or moral framing. The voice was direct and performative, mirroring how he spoke. These early writings were not polished. Grammar was inconsistent. Structure was loose. What they had instead was presence. He wrote as if addressing someone directly, as if daring the reader to keep going. Prison life provided endless material. Routines, grudges, confrontations, boredom. He did not analyze the system. He described it as he experienced it. Other inmates noticed the writing gradually, not because it circulated widely, but because Reed talked about it. He mentioned it in conversation, sometimes mockingly, sometimes with pride. Officers were aware as well, though they did not treat it as unusual. Many inmates wrote letters, journals, complaints. Writing itself did not attract attention unless it caused problems. Reed's writing did not initially cause problems. It did not threaten staff. It did not name active cases. It did not incite violence. As far as the institution was concerned, it was contained expression. There was no formal encouragement, but there was also no interference. What distinguished his writing from most prison journaling was tone. He was not documenting survival. He was performing identity. The page became another place where he could assert presence, where his voice could dominate without interruption. He exaggerated, dramatized, and leaned into extremity. Truth was secondary to impact. At this stage, there was no external audience, no publisher, no editor. The writing existed inside the prison ecosystem only. It circulated informally when it circulated at all. Pages were shown to a few people, then folded away. Some drafts were lost, others rewritten. The process was uneven and unstructured. Writing also fit within the limitations of prison life. It required no equipment beyond basic supplies. It could be done alone. It did not rely on physical strength or social positioning. For someone dealing with injuries and chronic pain, it was accessible. The body could fail. The voice on the page could continue. There was no transformation associated with this phase. Reed did not become reflective or remorseful through writing. He did not soften. If anything, the written voice sharpened the same qualities he displayed verbally. The difference was control. On the page, he decided what appeared and what did not. There were no immediate consequences, no instant rebuttals. Prison authorities did not view the writing as rehabilitation. It was not part of a program. It was not guided or reviewed. It was simply tolerated. From their perspective, an inmate occupied with writing was an inmate not causing immediate disruption. the content itself remained firmly grounded in the prison world. There were no attempts yet to frame his life as narrative or to explain how he arrived there. The focus was immediate and concrete. Interactions, grievances, assertions of toughness. The writing mirrored his environment, narrow and intense. Importantly, this phase did not yet involve ambition. There was no plan to reach beyond the walls. The idea that these writings might exist outside the prison was not central. What mattered was that the act of writing gave structure to time and another surface on which to project himself. The prison system remained unchanged by this activity. His classification did not improve. His conditions did not ease. Writing did not buy him privileges or protection. It existed parallel to everything else, neither solving nor worsening his situation. This period ended not because the writing stopped, but because the writing encountered something new. Interest. Not institutional interest, and not yet public attention, but the recognition that the voice on the page could travel further than the man behind the walls. By the end of the 1980s, Mark Chopper Reed was still firmly inside the prison system, but the writing he had begun in isolation was no longer entirely contained there. This shift did not happen suddenly, and it did not begin with a publisher circling or a deal being offered. It began, as many prison narratives do, through informal contact and slow leakage. Reed's writing started to move through other people. Pages were shared with visitors, sometimes deliberately, sometimes casually. Letters went out containing fragments of stories or passages copied by hand. Inmates spoke about what he was writing, often exaggerating it, sometimes mocking it, sometimes impressed despite themselves. The words travelled before the author did. At this stage, the writing was still raw. There was no coherent book structure, no clear beginning or end. What existed instead were scenes, anecdotes, confrontations rendered in a blunt, confrontational voice. The tone was consistent, aggressive, unapologetic, and often darkly humorous. Reed did not write to explain himself. He wrote to assert presence. Journalists had already begun circling Australian prisons during this period, drawn by broader conversations about crime, punishment, and the failures of rehabilitation. Prison writing was not unheard of. What made Reed's material stand out was not its insight, but its confidence. It did not ask for sympathy, it did not apologize. It challenged the reader directly, daring them to judge while still wanting to continue. Contact with journalists did not begin as a formal collaboration. It emerged through correspondence, a letter exchanged, a phone call facilitated through official channels, questions asked, responses returned. Reed was careful enough to avoid naming active cases or implicating himself in unresolved crimes. He had learned, through years of interrogation, where legal boundaries lay. Prison authorities were aware of the correspondence. Mail was monitored. Conversations were logged. Nothing about the communication violated regulations. Inmates were allowed to write and journalists were permitted to correspond, provided security was not compromised. The system did not intervene because there was nothing concrete to intervene against. As exchanges continued, the idea of shaping the material into something publishable began to form, not as a sudden ambition but as a gradual recognition. Reed understood instinctively that his voice carried impact. Others confirmed it. Journalists recognized that the writing did not sound like institutional grievance or rehabilitation rhetoric. It sounded like confrontation. The process was uneven. Drafts were sent out and returned with comments. Sections were rewritten by hand. Pages were lost, rewritten again, or discarded. Prison logistics slowed everything. Access to paper was limited. Writing time competed with routines, lockdowns, and transfers. There was no steady rhythm, only persistence. Importantly, Reed did not cede control of his voice. While journalists assisted in shaping material and advising on structure, the tone remained his. He resisted sanitization. He refused moral framing. The writing did not seek to contextualize his violence within social theory or personal trauma. It presented events as he chose to tell them, stripped of apology. This stance was not accidental. Reed understood power dynamics well enough to know that compromise diluted impact. If the writing was going to exist outside prison, it would do so on his terms or not at all. That insistence slowed the process, but preserved the voice that had drawn interest in the first place. The decision to pursue publication formally required navigating legal boundaries. In Australia, prisoners were permitted to publish writing, provided it did not interfere with justice or endanger others. There was no automatic prohibition on profiting from such work at the time. This legal context mattered. It allowed conversations to continue without immediate shutdown. Eventually, a manuscript began to take shape, assembled from fragments written across years. It was not a memoir in the traditional sense. It did not follow a clean chronology or offer reflection. It functioned more like a series of confrontations stitched together by voice, rather than narrative arc. The prison environment shaped the final form. There was no space for subtlety. The writing reflected a world where directness mattered more than nuance, where survival depended on projection. Editing focused less on smoothing and more on preserving momentum. Throughout this process, Reed remained incarcerated. He did not attend meetings. He did not negotiate face to face. Everything passed through intermediaries, letters, and controlled communication. The physical distance reinforced his reliance on language. The page carried what his body could not. By the time the manuscript was ready for publication, nothing about his daily life inside had improved. He remained under supervision, subject to the same constraints as before. Writing had not earned him privilege or leniency. It had simply created a channel outward. The moment the manuscript left the prison system formally was not marked by ceremony. No announcement was made. No anticipation acknowledged. For Reed, it was another transfer, another document moving beyond his immediate reach. The difference was destination. For the first time, something he had produced inside prison was entering a space he could not control directly. How it would be received, interpreted, or used was no longer entirely up to him. That uncertainty did not soften his tone. If anything, it reinforced his commitment to staying confrontational. The story had left the walls. What it would become outside them was about to reshape everything that followed. When Bana Chopper Reed finally walked out through the prison gates, nothing about the moment resembled freedom in the cinematic sense. There was no crowd, no statement, no symbolic pause to mark the transition from inmate to civilian. The exit was administrative, procedural, and deliberately unremarkable. A door opened, a door closed, the system moved on. This was not a pardon and not an act of mercy. It was a regular release on parole, governed by conditions rather than sentiment. He was allowed back into the world, but only just. Movement came with restrictions. Behavior came with consequences. The leash was long enough to function, but short enough to snap tight at the first sign of trouble. Physically, the years inside were written all over him. The body that stepped out was not the body that had entered decades earlier. Missing fingers altered balance and gesture. Dental damage reshaped his face and speech. Scars interrupted skin like footnotes no one bothered to explain. Nothing had been repaired. only managed well enough to keep him operational. Outside, the world had not been waiting. The streets moved faster than he remembered. People ignored him with professional efficiency. Shops, cars, voices, advertisements all pressed forward without recognition. Prison time compresses memory. Release stretches it painfully thin. Everything felt louder, sharper, less interested in accommodating him. There was also the matter of visibility. Inside, he had been known by reputation and file number. Outside, he was anonymous again, at least for the moment. The book existed, but its author was still largely abstract. Readers knew the voice, not the body. The persona had not yet acquired a face in public space. Parole imposed structure where instinct wanted chaos. Regular reporting, restrictions on association. Clear expectations communicated in neutral language. The rules were not subtle, and they were not negotiable. The tolerance that had existed inside for disruption did not extend outward. There would be no slow escalation here, no endless warnings. The margin for error was narrow by design. This mattered because Reed had never been good at margins. Social reintegration was awkward and incomplete. Old connections were unreliable, either wary or unwilling to reconnect under scrutiny. New ones were tentative, shaped by curiosity rather than trust. The man who had learned to operate through fear now existed in a space where fear had consequences he could not afford. There was no immediate rush of opportunity, no invitations, no sudden transformation into a public figure. The release did not generate momentum on its own. If anything, it exposed how thin the bridge was between notoriety on paper and presence in reality. The book had circulated. It had unsettled. It had provoked discussion. But it had not yet created a role for the man himself. That gap remained, waiting to be filled or mishandled. Reed navigated this phase cautiously, though caution did not come naturally. He was aware, at least intellectually, that everything now rested on restraint. Any incident would not be absorbed into institutional routine. It would trigger a response with a clock attached. Parole is not patience. It is tolerance measured in days. This period was quiet by necessity. There were no stages, no cameras, no controlled performances. Just movement through ordinary spaces under extraordinary scrutiny. Each interaction carried weight. Each decision accumulated risk. The distance between the persona on the page and the man outside the gate was still intact. That distance would not last. The conditions for collapse or expansion were already in place, waiting for contact with an audience. For now, though, the story paused in a narrow corridor between confinement and visibility. The walls were gone, but their logic lingered. The next transformation would not come from release itself, but from what happened once the world realized the author was no longer confined to paper. That realization was already approaching. Once Bana Chopper Reed became physically available, the media did what the prison system never could. It turned him into a spectacle on schedule. The book had prepared the ground, but it was the man himself who completed the circuit. Television did not discover him cautiously. It embraced him with the particular enthusiasm reserved for figures who make producers nervous and ratings spike. Talk shows were the first test. He arrived without the usual choreography of apology or explanation. Hosts expected reflection. They received assertion. Questions about violence were met with flat acknowledgement rather than regret. When pressed for moral framing, he declined to supply one. The effect was unsettling, and that discomfort became the format's fuel. He understood television faster than most first-time guests. He leaned into silence instead of filling it. He answered directly, then stopped. The lack of embellishment forced interviewers to keep talking, often revealing more about their expectations than about him. He did not argue. He did not justify. He simply occupied the space until it bent around him. Comedy formats amplified this tension. The laughter came inconsistently, often at moments that felt inappropriate even to the audience producing it. Reed did not chase the reaction. He allowed jokes to land without acknowledgement, creating a delay that sharpened the absurdity. The humour was not collaborative. It emerged from friction. Public readings and festival appearances followed, though reading is generous. He did not perform literature in the traditional sense. He performed presence. Pages were secondary. The audience came to see whether the voice they had encountered on paper could exist unfiltered in front of them. It could, and it did so without concession. Across appearances, a clear persona formed, not because it was invented, but because it was consistently maintained. He presented himself as a figure without remorse and without interest in victim narratives. This omission was not accidental. It was structural. The moment he allowed the focus to drift away from himself, control would be lost. Control was the point. The media responded accordingly. He was framed as the honest psychopath, the man who refused to pretend that violence could be redeemed through insight. This label was applied by others more often than by him, and he neither rejected nor endorsed it. He allowed it to circulate, understanding that ambiguity extended its lifespan. Visually, he made no effort to soften the impression. Missing teeth were not concealed. Scars were not explained. The body told its own story, and he did not interrupt it. In an environment obsessed. With image management, his refusal to manage it read as authenticity, even when it was clearly strategic. Crucially, he never positioned himself as reformed. He did not speak about lessons learned or transformation achieved. When asked about rehabilitation, he redirected or dismissed the premise entirely. The narrative of progress bored him. The narrative of endurance did not. This stance created division, and division guaranteed return invitations. Producers understood that he did not need to be liked to be effective. He needed to be watched. Each appearance reinforced the same message. The persona on the page was not an exaggeration. It was a direct continuation. Audiences responded unevenly. Some recoiled. Others leaned forward. Letters followed. Invitations multiplied. The media cycle fed on its own momentum. What had begun as curiosity hardened into expectation. When he appeared, something uncomfortable would happen, and that discomfort became reliable. At no point did he attempt to widen the frame. There were no acknowledgements of victims, no gestures toward responsibility beyond factual admission. Violence was treated as history, not as debt. This refusal drew criticism, but it also defined the boundary of his public role. He was not there to resolve anything. He was there to persist. Over time, the distinction between man and character blurred, not because he lost control, but because he refused to separate them. There was no backstage version offered to the audience. What they saw was what they got, again and again, until repetition itself became proof. This phase did not last because it could not. Media cycles consume quickly. What sustained it for as long as it did was consistency. He did not evolve. He did not soften. He did not apologize. He remained fixed. And fixation reads as strength in a culture that expects revision. By the end of this period, the figure known as Chopper was no longer confined to bookshops or interviews. He had become recognizable on sight, a reference point rather than a curiosity. The groundwork had been laid for something larger than appearances alone. The next step would remove even the requirement of his physical presence. transforming the persona into an object others could inhabit, reinterpret, and export. That shift would not come from a television studios or festival stages, but from a medium capable of detaching the myth from the man entirely. The transformation of Mark Chopper. Read from media curiosity into something closer to a cultural artifact did not happen through another interview or public appearance. It happened the moment his persona became portable. Film made that possible. Once the story no longer required his physical presence, it could travel without him, multiplying in ways he could influence but never fully control. The release of Chopper marked that shift. The film did not attempt biography in the conventional sense. It did not reconstruct events carefully or interrogate timelines. Instead, it adopted tone as its organizing principle. What appeared on screen was not a factual accounting of Mark Reed's life, but a cinematic rendering of how he presented himself. The distinction mattered, even if it was rarely acknowledged. Casting Eric Bana was central to that effect. Bana did not play a criminal as documented by court records. He played Chopper as Chopper wanted to be seen. The performance leaned into contradiction. Charm and menace, humor and threat, absurdity and violence coexisting without. Explanation. The film never paused to resolve those tensions. It allowed them to sit, uncomfortably, as the defining feature. Humor was not used to soften violence. It existed alongside it, often amplifying its impact by refusing moral commentary. Scenes that might have invited condemnation instead invited laughter, not because the acts were trivial, but because the framing disrupted expectation. This refusal to guide audience response became one of the film's most unsettling traits. The absence of moral instruction was not accidental. The film offered no lesson and no redemptive arc. It did not suggest that understanding equaled forgiveness, or that brutality could be neutralized by insight. Viewers were left to negotiate their own reactions, and many did so noisily. Debate followed, criticism followed, so did fascination. International attention arrived quickly. What had previously been a distinctly Australian story began circulating in broader cultural spaces, detached from its local context. The figure of Chopper became recognizable beyond geography. References appeared in music journalism, film criticism, and pop commentary. He was no longer just a subject. He was a symbol. This shift altered the nature of his public presence. Where media appearances required active performance, the film allowed passivity. Others now carried the image for him. Quotes circulated. Scenes were replayed. The character took on a life that did not require constant reinforcement. That independence was both powerful and limiting. Rockstar proximity emerged during this period, not as deep association, but as surface collision. Musicians, already accustomed to courting danger as aesthetic, recognized the value of the Chopper image. It signaled transgression without requiring commitment. Photographs circulated of Reed alongside artists, moments of shared space rather than shared history. Among these was the widely referenced image involving Anthony Kiedis, a snapshot that said less about personal connection than about cultural overlap. These encounters did not imply friendship or collaboration. They functioned symbolically. The criminal turned media figure standing beside musicians whose personas thrived on excess created an impression of mutual recognition. The image did its work precisely because it was ambiguous. Viewers filled the gaps with their own assumptions. What mattered was not intimacy, but adjacency. Chopper had become adjacent to fame rather than confined by notoriety. The transition from feared individual to pop cultural reference point was complete. He was no longer simply discussed. He was cited. This phase did not erase his criminal past, but it reframed it. Violence became aesthetic rather than immediate. The consequences receded behind performance. The character overshadowed the acts that had produced it. This was not unique to Chopper, but the speed at which it occurred was notable. Importantly, the film did not end his involvement in shaping the narrative. He commented on it. He endorsed aspects of it. He enjoyed its refusal to moralize. The version of himself presented on screen aligned closely enough with his own self-conception to feel authentic, even if it departed significantly from documented reality. The result was a feedback loop. The film reinforced the persona, which in turn validated earlier media appearances, which then fed back into audience interpretation of the film. Each element strengthened the others. Chopper was no longer just appearing. He was circulating. This was the apex of his cultural visibility. From here on, the myth would persist even when his presence diminished. The image had been released into a system that no longer required his participation to sustain itself. What followed would interrupt that cycle abruptly, not through cultural fatigue, but through consequence. The figure that film and pop culture had elevated would soon collide again with the legal reality it had temporarily escaped. The pop cultural elevation of Mark Chopper Reed did not protect him from gravity. It merely delayed it. While the film circulated freely and the persona continued to echo through interviews, photographs, and secondhand myth, the legal framework surrounding his life remained intact and unforgiving. Parole does not dissolve simply because an image becomes valuable. It waits. The conditions that had governed his release never disappeared. They hovered in the background, quietly restrictive, legally precise. Behavior was monitored. Associations mattered. Movement had limits. What had once been absorbed by prison routine now accumulated externally, recorded rather than contained. The same traits that made him compelling on screen proved incompatible with the narrow tolerances of conditional freedom. Incidents followed, not as a single dramatic collapse, but as a gradual accumulation. Allegations of violence resurfaced. Threats were reported. Weapons entered the narrative again, not as props or metaphors, but as evidence. Each breach narrowed the space available to him. Each warning reduced the margin for performance. The justice system did not engage with his cultural status. Courts do not recognize personas. They recognize behavior. The mythology that had grown around him offered no insulation. If anything, visibility sharpened scrutiny. What might once have passed unnoticed now carried weight because attention magnified consequence. The return to prison was procedural and unromantic. There was no dramatic reversal, no symbolic fall from grace. He was processed, assessed, and confined. The machinery resumed exactly where it had left off. Files were updated, doors closed. The rhythm of incarceration reasserted itself without commentary. Inside, the contrast was immediate. The outside world had frozen him at a moment of cultural relevance. Inside, time moved differently. The film continued circulating, but he did not. References reached him indirectly, through conversation, through fragments, through the knowledge that something bearing his name now existed independently of his physical presence. This separation created a peculiar dissonance. The character continued evolving without him, while the man returned to routine. Pop culture had extracted what it needed. The institution reclaimed what it always had. The two systems did not communicate. Prison life resumed with familiar indifference. Privileges were limited. Surveillance constant. Behavior was recorded, not interpreted. There was no interest in his media phase beyond its logistical implications. Fame did not alter classification. It did not soften restrictions. It did not buy patience. The return also exposed the fragility of the myth. Without constant reinforcement, the persona lost immediacy. Outside, it survived through repetition and reference. Inside, it held little currency. Inmates responded to presence, not reputation. Officers responded to compliance, not narrative. This phase lacked spectacle, and that absence mattered. It stripped the story back to consequence. The body that had been photographed beside musicians now moved through corridors governed by the same rules as before. The voice that had unsettled audiences now echoed only in controlled spaces. Importantly, this was not the end. It was interruption. The myth did not collapse. It paused. The film did not disappear. The references did not evaporate. They simply continued without him, detached from daily reality. From within confinement, Reed remained aware of his external existence as a figure. He commented on it when possible. He did not renounce it. He did not express surprise at the return. The system had always been part of the arrangement. The oscillation between visibility and containment was not a contradiction. It was pattern. The difference this time was scale. The gap between who he was perceived to be and where he physically existed had never been wider. Outside, he was a symbol. Inside, he was again a file, a number, a problem to be managed. This return to prison did not generate new narrative. It absorbed the old one. The cycle had tightened. What remained unresolved was how it would end, because this was no longer a question of behavior alone. Time had entered the equation in a more decisive way. The next chapter would not concern performance, media, or myth-building. It would concern decline, limitation, and the final administrative decision that removed him from the system not because he had changed, but because his body no longer allowed it to continue. By the time Mark Chopper Reed was released for the last time, the decision had nothing to do with parole, behavior, or public interest. It was medical. The system did not reconsider him as a person or a figure. It assessed his body and found it no longer compatible with custody. The diagnosis was terminal liver cancer. The progression was not subtle. Treatment options were limited, prognosis worse. Prison healthcare is designed to maintain function, not to manage decline. Once his condition crossed the threshold of custody viability, the remaining steps were administrative. Reports were filed, assessments reviewed. The conclusion was unavoidable. Continued incarceration served no institutional purpose. This release carried none of the ambiguity of the first. There were no conditions to manage long-term behavior, no expectations of reintegration, no quiet optimism that things might stabilize. It was palliative, explicit in its intent. He was released because he was dying. Physically, the man who left custody bore little resemblance to the figure that had circulated through media and film. Weight loss altered his frame. Illness hollowed him. Movement slowed. Pain management became the priority. The body that had once been used deliberately as instrument and message now demanded attention simply to function at all. Yet the persona did not dissolve with the body. Interviews continued, though fewer and more controlled. His voice remained sharp, even as endurance faded. He did not soften the narrative. He did not pivot toward apology or reflection. Questions about mortality did not produce confessions. He spoke as he always had, grounded in assertion rather than reconciliation. What was absent was escalation. There was no longer energy for provocation. The confrontational edge dulled, not by insight, but by limitation. He was no longer capable of sustaining the performance at full volume. The role remained intact, but the stage had shrunk. Public interest persisted unevenly. Some outlets treated the illness as closure. Others framed it as final proof of the toll his life had taken. The coverage did not reshape his image. It added an endpoint. The mythology required an ending, and biology supplied one. Importantly, this phase did not generate a final act of reinvention. He did not seek redemption narratives. He did not attempt to recast his story as cautionary. He did not reach for legacy management beyond what already existed. The character had been built too deliberately, too consistently, to be revised at the end. Death arrived in October 2013. It was neither dramatic nor symbolic. It occurred quietly, medically, without spectacle. The systems that had contained him for decades closed their files. Media outlets recycled familiar images. The persona outlived the body by default. The absence of a transformative conclusion unsettled some observers. There was no final reckoning, no confession, no apology offered on cue. The story ended without satisfying the moral expectations often imposed on narratives of violence. That discomfort was fitting. It mirrored the structure of the life itself. In the aftermath, discussion returned to familiar ground. Was he a monster or a performer? Was the myth larger than the man? Did the attention given to him say more about culture than about crime? These questions circulated because they had never been resolved while he lived. What remained undeniable was consistency. From first notoriety to final interview, he refused to shift the frame. He did not pretend to be misunderstood. He did not ask to be forgiven. He did not attempt to be instructive. The same stance that had carried him through prison, media, and pop culture held until the end. The final release did not represent freedom in any meaningful sense. It represented termination of obligation. The institution released him because it no longer needed to contain him. The world received him because it always absorbs what the system discards. Death closed the sequence without commentary. What followed was interpretation, repetition, and reassessment, none of which altered the fact that the role he had built was complete. The last chapter would not add new facts. It would address what exactly that role amounted to once the man was gone. When Mark Chopper Reed died, nothing resolved itself. There was no narrative click, no moral alignment snapping into place, no sudden clarity that made the years of violence, performance, attention, and contradiction cohere into something tidy. What followed instead was sorting, repetition, repackaging. The slow institutional habit of deciding what kind of thing a person had been once they were no longer present to interfere. The temptation, as always, was categorization. To reduce him to a type that could be safely handled. Genius or brute. Monster or clown. Product of his environment or author of his own destruction. Each label promised closure, and each failed to deliver it. He resisted reduction not because he was complex in a reflective sense, but because he was consistent in a way that made simplification dishonest. He was not a criminal mastermind. There is no evidence of strategic brilliance, long-term planning, or organizational control that would justify that framing. His violence was direct, impulsive, and often reckless. It achieved short-term dominance, not sustainable power. The myth of intelligence attached itself later, imported by audiences who prefer their villains articulate. He was not a serial killer in any forensic sense. Claims of extensive killing remain largely unproven, exaggerated by his own narration and amplified by repetition. The absence of confirmation did not diminish the fear those claims generated. And fear was the point. Precision was never required. He was also not a victim in the redemptive way the word is often used. His childhood was neglectful, violent, and destabilizing, but it did not remove agency. He made choices repeatedly, even when alternatives narrowed. Context explains behavior. It does not absolve it. What he was, without question, was violent. Not symbolically violent, not rhetorically violent. Violent in action, in threat, in posture. People were harmed. Lives were altered. Fear was not theoretical. Any assessment that omits this fact in favor of cultural commentary fails at the most basic level. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to treat his violence as chaotic or meaningless. He understood its utility. He deployed it selectively, sometimes against others, sometimes against himself. The finger amputations were not madness, they were leverage. The scars were not incidental, they were evidence. This brings us to the body. The missing teeth, so often treated as grotesque detail or accidental decay, were part of the same logic. They were not cosmetic failures to be corrected. They were left visible. The damage was allowed to speak. In a media environment that prizes recognizable images, his face became shorthand. The mouth, altered and unfinished, communicated unpredictability faster than words ever could. Like the fingers, the teeth were not explained away. They were presented. The effect was cumulative. Body damage became brand reinforcement. Not consciously managed in a marketing sense, but consistently exploited once its impact was understood. This is where the idea of strategy becomes unavoidable, not in planning crimes, but in managing perception. He learned early that fear travels faster than truth and lasts longer than explanation. Everything that followed built on that insight. The books, the interviews, the refusal of remorse, the selective silences. Each element reinforced the same message. Do not look for comfort here. Pop culture embraced this clarity. The film did not moralize because the persona did not invite morality. Music culture flirted with the image because it signaled transgression without demanding accountability. Audiences engaged because discomfort can be entertaining when it is safely mediated. None of this required him to change. That was the crucial advantage. He did not need to reinvent himself for new contexts. He simply remained the same and allowed others to project onto that consistency whatever meaning suited them. The cost of this approach was isolation. Not emotional isolation, which had been present from the beginning, but structural isolation. There was no pathway to reintegration, because reintegration would have required surrendering the very traits that sustained relevance. He chose persistence over resolution every time. This is why the ending feels unsatisfying to those who expect transformation. There was none. Illness limited capacity, not conviction. Death ended activity, not narrative. What remains is not a lesson, but a pattern. A demonstration of how violence, when combined with media literacy and cultural appetite, can be converted into identity and sustained without correction. Not celebrated universally, not condemned conclusively, but circulated endlessly. That circulation says as much about the audience as it does about the man. The discomfort he generated was not a flaw in the system. It was evidence that the system was working as designed. Bana Chopper, Reed, did not leave behind wisdom or warning. He left behind a template, one that shows how a person can refuse moral negotiation entirely and still be absorbed, referenced, and remembered. Not because he was admirable, not because he was brilliant, but because he understood something simple and unpleasant very early on. If you make yourself impossible to resolve, people will keep looking long after they should have stopped. And that's where we leave it, Sleepless Rebel. If you like this one, click like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments who should enter the Freak Show next. This is Napmax. Good night.